Open your Bibles, if you would, to Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3. Perspective is a powerful thing. Sometimes we forget just how limited our perspective really is. In the world of thousands of years of human history, we only live a small segment of it. And with a globe as different across the cultures and climates as it is, we only live in a very few places. Perspective is interesting. A few months ago, I remember hearing someone talk about how the world was overpopulated and something needs to be done about that. And this particular person was a voice over on the East Coast, up northeast, and I thought, wow, I don't think they've ever driven through Kansas. Because when you drive across our country or you drive across Canada, you say to yourself, there's a little more room yet. I learned this lesson years ago. My family moved. My father was in ministry all those years, and so we moved. And some of the most interesting changes were we had lived for some time in Idaho and then moved to Missouri and then moved back to Idaho. That's a lot of difference in culture and in climate. And I remember being in grade school and I was talking to my little buddies in Missouri and I was talking about Idaho and they said, what is it like? And I said, well, it's got these huge mountains and it snows where you can't even see over it. And in grade school that would have been true. And that it gets so cold that one time it got 40 below zero. And my little buddies rolled their eyes and said, you're the biggest liar we've ever met. Now you got to keep in mind, this is before the internet. Does anybody remember that? This is before you could just watch videos of people throwing water in the air and it freezing before it hits the ground. This is before you could just Google it. This is when truly your perspective of the world was small indeed. Well, after a couple of years of doing time there, the locals call it Missouri. If you're not from there, it's just misery is what we called it. But we moved back to Idaho and I'm still in grade school and they're like, wow, you're back. And I said, I'm back. We've been in this crazy place called Missouri. Really, what's it like? And I said, it gets so hot there. One time it got 106. And they scuffed their toe in the dirt and they said, you're the biggest liar we've ever met. It's hard to imagine what you haven't seen. It's easy to forget there's a much broader, bigger, and deeper picture than we may ever personally experience. So I want to talk to you about the essential church, but I want to start from a perspective that I sometimes forget. What comes to your mind when I say, how's the church doing? What's the image that pops into your mind? Is it this particular building, or perhaps it's this group of people? It's folks that you know, and you might have a little broader vision. You might think about some of the Christians you know that live in other towns, or maybe some of our folks that have moved off, or maybe some that have moved from other places. But the essential church was a part and is a part of God's eternal master plan. And I find that encouraging. See, the problem was in Genesis chapter 3, by the time you get through this amazing creation, this wonderful world, this perfect place that gets wrecked by Adam and Eve's choices, they decide that they know as much or more than God. They want to know more. They eat of the fruit and bring sin into the world. And their lack of belief wreaks havoc in this perfect place that God made. And God had warned them that if you eat of this fruit, you will die. And they didn't drop dead, but something even worse happened. Their relationship with God is broken and dies. There's something new. There's a distance, and there's a shame, and there's a nakedness that they had never known before. As God meets with them in chapter 3, and He tells them about the consequences that have come, the brokenness that they and you and I will continually endure, He says something, though. There's a promise in verse 15 of Genesis 3. It's right after the first sin, and so it's the first promise of redemption. That this problem, this brokenness, this distance, this fact that Adam and Eve are getting kicked out of the garden, this truth that they no longer live in such closeness with God that He just comes around in the afternoon and hangs out with them and chats. For that is God's original design, and it is His heart's desire. So when that gets wrecked, There's a promise. And it's within this statement to the woman in verse 15, to Satan as represented in the serpent. He says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." With the New Testament perspective, this sparse prophecy makes all the more sense. That there's a time coming when a descendant of Eve will be in battle against this force that is embodied in the serpent, that is Satan. And that her descendant will be bruised. But if you're going to get an injury, would you rather have a heel injury or a head injury? One makes you hobble, the other kills you or defeats you. It's the first promise of the Messiah. The word Messiah means the promised one, the chosen one, the anointed one. It's the first time that God says so early, just as they're understanding the consequences of their sin, He makes His promise of redemption. There's one coming who will fix this, and it's the Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, who will come and He will rescue us from this. Turn, if you would, to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1. As God uses Matthew to teach us of the good news of Jesus Christ so early in this gospel, this promise is being fulfilled. For as the angel speaks to Joseph in Matthew chapter 1 and tells him about the coming child and about the name that he should give this child, his name has meaning. Jesus isn't just a name, it is the name given in purpose. For as he tells David, "Don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife," verse 21, "She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." To Adam and Eve, God said to Eve, "I know that you are ashamed. I know that you are broken. I know that your sin, your willful sin has brought this," and Adam shared in that as well. But he says to her, there's promise. As she listens to God deal out this consequence to the serpent, she hears promise, and Adam hears promise. And now God says to Joseph, that's why you'll call him Jesus, because he's going to save his people from their sins. And this promise will be fulfilled in a kingdom. An idea that is so powerful that in Matthew chapter 2, that there are wise men that travel great distance and to great inconvenience, searching for a certain one found in verse 2. When they come to Herod, they say, "Where is he who's been born King of the Jews?" For they're not only searching for a Messiah, they're searching for a king. One who would rule, one who would establish a different place. One who would establish a kingdom so unlike anything they'd ever seen. In fact, later, when Pilate would question Jesus, "So, you are a king," Jesus would say, "My kingdom is not of this world. Otherwise, my servants would fight." It's not like the kingdom you're expecting. Pilate's beyond your ability to grasp. You're thinking Caesar, you're thinking Rome, you're even thinking Herod and Judea. I'm thinking not of this world, but in the world. A kingdom so different that Jesus describes it in Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5, he begins what we call the Sermon on the Mount, these blessed statements, when he says, like in verse 3, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Throughout the Gospels, Jesus will say that this is about the kingdom of heaven. But it's heaven on earth. Because he's not talking about the kingdom of heaven in the sense of where God reigns, for he's talking to human beings and about their opportunity, their invitation to participate in this kingdom of heaven. That it would be in this kingdom of heaven on earth that people would find a community that would last all the way to the eternal heaven. Jesus describes this kingdom. You can sense already that it is not of this world. It isn't political. It isn't about a monarchy. It isn't about taxes and about crowns and about armies and about squires. That is quite different, because he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." He goes through in the next 10 verses a description of something so different. It's to be powerful and impactful. He would say by the time he gets to verse 13, he describes this kingdom of heaven as if it's the salt of the earth and the light of the world, that it draws and transforms those who come. It would be this kingdom that Jesus would establish. John the Baptist began his preaching back in Matthew 3 by saying, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's nearby. It's right here." In Matthew 4, that's how Jesus started preaching. Repent, because the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He would later say that there were those listening to him who would not taste of death until his kingdom was established. The disciples struggled with clarity as they kept picturing a brick and mortar kingdom, or certainly one established that they're familiar with. But Jesus kept saying it's a kingdom of heaven on earth. Even as he taught us to pray in Matthew chapter 6, he gives us this expression when he says in verse 9, "Pray then in this way, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." God's will is being done in the heavenly realms, in the eternal realms, but the great work of God that was promised in Genesis 3 is that the heavenly realms' will would be worked out on earth among mankind. Folks, the church is huge. The church is magnificent. The church is eternal and the church is powerful. That's what Jesus said over in Matthew chapter 16. It's interesting in this chapter that Jesus sets up the conversation about the kingdom of heaven or the church by asking, "Who do people say that I am?" Because what is a kingdom if it's not about the king? For the kingdom will be as the king is. And so Jesus says, "Well, who do people say that I am?" And there's a flurry of answers. Well, some say John the Baptist or Elijah or one of the prophets. And he says, "But who do you say I am?" Because uniquely, this is a kingdom whose borders are defined simply by where and among whom Jesus reigns. For you could have two people standing side by side, and the kingdom of heaven has come to earth in one life, but not in another, though they are in such close physical proximity. That the transformative and saving power of the kingdom would come to one life, but not to the one next to it, dependent on whether or not they have inaugurated Jesus as king. That's why Jesus says, "Well, who am I to you?" So in verse 16, Simon Peter said, "You're the Christ." That's the word that goes all the way back to Genesis 3. You're the promised one, the anointed one, the chosen one. You're the one that God was talking about when he was talking to the snake. That's who you are. And Jesus says, "That's right." Well, he says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." The reason that Simon is blessed is because he has inaugurated Jesus as king in his own life. It is that knowledge, it is that recognition, it is the surrender to that truth that brings the kingdom of heaven to earth in your life and in mine. It is so meaningful, so powerful that Jesus said in verse 18, "I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." The rock of his confession, the truth of him being the Christ. And he says, "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it." Not even death can overcome the Lord's church. That was the original problem. That's what God said. If you eat of this fruit, you will die. That's the original and oldest and most relentless enemy of man is death. And God says, "You try this, and it's going to kill you." And they did, and we do. That's the redemption. That's the bruising of the serpent's head. That's the destruction of Satan. That's Satan crucifying Jesus, putting him in the tomb, and sealing it and celebrating. Only for that victory to be shattered by the Lord's resurrection. Jesus says that not even death can overcome the church. In fact, to those in whom the kingdom reigns, death is merely the portal to our eternal place in heaven. It is not a defeat, it is a transition. It is a time to celebrate, it is a homecoming. What was man's greatest enemy becomes the servant of man to lift them from this world to the next. Peter draws the analogy that in the days of the flood, the waters came and wiped out all the living, but yet in one sense it also transported, due to their faithfulness in building the ark, Jonah, not Peter, Noah and his family, we'll get there eventually, transported Noah and his family to a brand new world. What was destructive for some was the transport to a new world for others. And that's what death has become for us. Not the greatest calamity, but the homecoming or the transition to the kingdom of heaven eternal. Turn, if you would, to 1 Peter. 1 Peter. I asked you a few moments ago, what comes to your mind when I ask you, how's the church going? Or what's church like? Or how's your church? And often we're limited in our perspective to just the piece of this life that we know right here. Perhaps it was the building that came to mind, the faces that came to mind, this family that gathers here. But the church has always been God's essential plan for man. In fact, the word church actually means something. It comes from an expression like the one found in 1 Peter chapter 2. For Peter tells us in verse 4 that we've come to Jesus. Not only is He the King, but Peter's going to teach us that He's the living stone, that He's the cornerstone, that He's the foundation, and that all of us are brought together, built as living stones, that we become something larger, something more powerful, something more meaningful than our individual selves because we're built together in this structure. This structure that rests on the solid foundation of Jesus Christ. And now in verse 9 he says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession." That we are definitively His. That we have been chosen by Him, and that we have been chosen with purpose. Because it's not just enough to parade around and say, well, I'm the chosen one. What really struck me reading through the Sermon on the Mount again, thinking about this message today, there's always something else that hits me, and this time it dawned on me that when Jesus says, you are the light of the world, when He says, you are the salt to the earth, He's not saying they will be, He says you are, and He's talking to Jews. For God had called them as a people, here Peter's quoting from those Old Testament passages, to be a light to the Gentiles. And they had turned inwardly. That somehow for the Jews, their chosenness was about their own inherent awesomeness. The reason they were the people of God is because they were better than others. And it was more about self-advancement, it was more about self-righteousness. And they forgot throughout the Old Testament, especially through Leviticus, God says over and over, I didn't choose you because you were powerful. Quite the opposite. Were you not slaves in Egypt and powerless? I didn't choose you because you were so righteous. That wouldn't be the reason. But that He chose them to display His magnificence and His grace to the world. Israel was originally called to be a missionary nation. And somehow they made it all about themselves. So when Peter quotes from these same passages, he reminds us that we are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation with purpose, he says. A people for God's own possession, here comes the purpose, so that, there's a reason, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him. The reason why that we're here today is Him. This isn't about us. And so often it's just a human frailty. We make it about us. When you listen to us complain, have you ever heard somebody walk out and say, well, I don't think God was properly glorified today? Oh, you might think about, well, that sermon wasn't as stunningly awesome as it is every other Sunday. Can I get an amen? Or maybe it's a comment about the singing, or maybe it's a comment about the pews, or maybe it's about whatever. But do we ever say, did we lift up God as He deserves today? Because when church becomes about us, that's really just the old-fashioned idea of idolatry. The reason that we are chosen is that we might proclaim His excellencies, not ours. In fact, listen to what he says next. He says, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who has called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. The word church comes from that expression, being called out. The church is not a building. The church is not a place. The church is the kingdom of heaven. It is the fulfillment of the promise made all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. The church are those people who have inaugurated Jesus Christ as Lord and King, whether we are in proximity with each other or scattered across the globe. The church are those who have been called out of darkness. That's where we came from. That's why we don't celebrate ourselves, because by ourselves, merely were those who were in darkness. But the light that we experience is because He's called us to it. He says that you've been called out of darkness into His marvelous light. For you once were not a people, but now you are the people of God. That you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. That God has called us home. What He said was, as Adam and Eve stood there in their newfound sense of nakedness and shame, I can imagine their head being down. They're not even looking up. They're just looking at the dirt. And they're hearing the first course of consequences delivered to the serpent. And then he's going to talk to Eve, and then he talks to Adam. And as they're standing there listening, there's this statement, this promise, because they're standing there in their shame, in their brokenness. They're going to be cast away from God, out of the garden into darkness, because they chose to leave. And Peter says, we've been called back into the light. Where we had been cast out, we're invited back home. Where before God had to separate Himself from us for our own benefit, for we could not be in His holy presence. Now we're called into His presence as a holy people. The church is the place where God reigns. The church is the place where we belong. Because of His choosing. Folks, it's magnificent to be in His church. It is magnificent to live in His kingdom. We fall prey to short-sightedness, a spiritual short-sightedness that we get overwhelmed by all that's going on, and it's an excellent opportunity to get overwhelmed by all that's going on. But what God is doing in us, what God is doing right here this morning, as we enthrone Him in our hearts, as we worship Him as King, what God is doing as He's called us out of darkness into light is eternal. Much longer than any virus. Much more powerful than any economy. Much more meaningful than any social connections. What God is doing has been from forever and will continue forever. And that's why we worship Him. We are subjects of the King in the greatest kingdom, subject to the greatest King that'll ever be. And so as we leave this place this morning, we have been called here this morning in worship for a purpose. Because it's not just here. For now we must go out and proclaim His excellencies. We need to proclaim His sovereignty. where there is fear, where there is frustration, where there is even fatigue, I'm just so tired of dealing with this, is our opportunity to proclaim Him. As we do all that we can do, let's lift up God is in control. As we talk about how we've got to make this adjustment and make that adjustment, that God is the great physician. For when we turn our eyes to Him, then His kingdom is vibrant. So may we be vibrant subjects of His kingdom this morning, and in the days to come, as we have been called out of darkness into His marvelous light, may we now proclaim His excellencies, that others may know Him. So this morning, can we encourage one another in any way? We invite you to one of these front pews that we might gather around you and pray for you, believing wholeheartedly that the King listens eagerly to our prayers. That when we lift one another, but we believe with all of our heart that our King is sovereign over the whole universe, so whatever it is that is hurting you, whatever is bringing harm to you, that He is more powerful than that. And then we will celebrate our trust that whatever His answer is, we will trust Him, believing that we are secure in His love. Would you make that decision this morning, whether it is to share a burden, or would you today decide that He is King, that He's Christ, and that He's Lord? Would you enthrone Him as King in your life by submitting to Him, being buried with Christ in the waters of baptism, that He would do His great work of calling you out of darkness into His marvelous light? Would you come this morning as together we stand and sing?